Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasting.
Dear everybody, I'm sorry for everything. I won't bother you anymore. Goodbye, Jaliek. This is the letter that Stephen Kerr said his 12-year-old adopted son left at his grandparents' home on November 1st, 2007, right before he went missing. By all accounts, Jaliek was an emotionally troubled boy, and there was a great deal of friction within his family. Is this a note written by a child right before he decided to run away? Or is there more to this letter and Jaliek's home life than it appears? Jaliek Rainwalker has been missing from Greenwich, New York for 17 years. During the first 12 tumultuous years of his life, he was failed by multiple people. Now, the question is, where is Jaliek Rainwalker and who is responsible for his disappearance? When a person goes missing, there's a special kind of pain in the not knowing. I want to tell the stories of those who never came home. Today, I want to tell you the story of Jaliek Rainwalker. I'm Kona Gallagher.
And I'm Ethan Flick.
And this is And Then They Were Gone. Welcome back, everyone.
Welcome back.
Thank you for joining us once again. I'm Kona.
And I'm Ethan.
And we're the husband and wife team behind this podcast. Each week, I tell you the story of an unsolved missing persons case. Ethan doesn't know anything about the story going into the episode, and he's here to provide his reactions and questions in real time, hopefully asking some of the same ones you have at home. Now, this week's story is one that's been on my list to cover for a while. It's absolutely heartbreaking and kind of reminds me of some of the other stories we've covered that deal with the foster care and adoption system in this country, like Oakley Carlson and Orrin and Orson West. Jaliek Rainwalker was born into difficult circumstances and was bounced around the foster care system. While he was ultimately adopted, instead of finding a loving and stable home, he entered into a situation that ultimately led to his disappearance one way or the other. But the reason I chose to cover this now is because Jaliek has been back in the news lately, and it did seem as though we could be close to a resolution. Also, the day this episode is released, November 1st, 2024, also marks the 17-year anniversary of Jaliek Rainwalker's disappearance. Before we get into this, though, we've had some folks join us over on Patreon, so we want to give a shout out to them. So thank you, Lara M., Melanie L., Madison S., and Wendy F. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you all so very, very much.
Remember, if you join us there on any level, starting at just $2 a month, you can get these episodes ad-free and also get a free copy of the ebook that I wrote. So now with that out of the way, let's get into the story of Jaliek Rainwalker. Jaliek L. Rainwalker was born on August 2nd, 1995 in Albany, New York. The names of his biological parents are unknown, as Jaliek was born into difficult circumstances. His biological mother dealt with substance use disorder, including during her pregnancy. And so Jaliek was born with drugs in his system.
Yikes.
Yeah. As a result of this, he was put into foster care when he was just 2 days old. Over the first several years of his life, Jaliek was bounced around different foster homes. He was prone to outbursts and other behavioral issues, so his caretakers were all required to be trained in therapeutic foster care.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's just like a New York State requirement.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there are only certain foster homes he could go to. Eventually, Jaliek was diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, or RAD. RAD is a condition that is diagnosed in children who are neglected during their formative years and thus unable to form healthy attachments to their primary caregivers prior to the age of 5. Some of the behaviors that children with RAD display include the inappropriate expression of emotions, difficulty making eye contact, difficulty expressing remorse or guilt, depression, and an aversion to physical touch. These children are also often prone to tantrums and are more prone to argue than other children of their age.
Well, that makes sense given that, like, you know, if you're an infant and you don't have that imprint with the parent, like, you're not going to learn like proper ways to interact with humans.
Right.
You know?
And yeah, when you don't have that safety and security as an infant, yeah, that absolutely affects everything that comes later in your life. By all accounts, Jaliek did have behavioral issues and was prone to violent outbursts. He also expressed both homicidal and suicidal thoughts at different points in his childhood, according to his adoptive parents. By the time he was 4 years old, Jaliek entered his 6th foster home, that of Jody and Larry Schoen. The Schoens loved Jaliek and provided a stable home for him. Jody said of Jaliek, quote, "He loved to run, loved to play soccer and play little jokes. He loved to read, and he loved his dinosaurs." End quote. The Schoens cared for Jaliek for the next several years and wanted to adopt him, despite the fact that they said his outbursts could be intense and would last up to an hour.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, Jaliek was a troubled child, but underneath it, he was kind and intelligent. However, when Jaliek was still just 6 years old, he physically attacked their young daughter. I don't have details on the attack itself, but it was bad enough that the Schoens made the difficult decision to halt the adoption process.
Oh, I'm sure that didn't translate well to Jaliek.
I know. I can't imagine just the feeling of rejection that must have gone along with that. So, yeah, they just felt that they could no longer manage his behavior or meet his needs. Jody would later say of Jaliek, quote, "He was our son, and you don't stop loving someone just because he can't live with you," end quote. After leaving the Schoens' home, Jaliek was placed in his 7th and final foster home, that of Stephen Kerr and Jocelyn McDonald. The family had 4 other children, 3 biological sons and 1 adopted daughter. At the time of Jaliek's disappearance in 2007, the other children ranged in age from 8 to 14. Though his foster parents' names were Kerr and McDonald, the couple didn't give either surname to their children, instead bestowing the name Rainwalker on all of them.
Interesting.
Yeah. I don't know what that's about, but yeah, they all had that. It's hard to get exact dates, but it seems as though Jaliek went to live with the family in 2002, and he was formally adopted in 2004 when he was around 9 years old. And this is where the story kind of stops making sense to me. Now, I'm not sure how easy or difficult it is to be approved as a foster parent in New York, but Stephen and Jocelyn were not only approved, but they were trained in therapeutic foster care, because I mentioned earlier that that was a requirement.
Right.
Furthermore, they were eventually approved to adopt Jaliek, and because he had special needs, they received a monthly adoption subsidy payment from the state. This was $1,500 per month tax-free money that was supposed to go toward Jaliek's care, including counseling and medication.
That was supposed to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is their second adopted child.
I do believe it was the second. I mean, I think they did adopt the other child prior to Jaliek.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, they do have 2 adopted children. And I don't know if that other children had special needs as well.
Right.
Now, to adopt any child in the state of New York, you have to pass several background checks and a home study has to be performed. According to the Adoptive and Foster Family Coalition, home studies are performed by licensed individuals, usually social workers. From their website, quote, "The purpose of the home study is to educate the adopting family and prepare them for adoption. The home study evaluates the capability of the family to ensure they are suitable to adopt a child. This step of the adoption process involves the social worker thoroughly gathering information about the family by visiting them at their home, interviewing their family, and ensuring that the parents will provide a healthy environment for any child." End quote. You're looking at me.
I mean, that's textbook of what a home study is, sure. But who is the social worker doing it? Like, and this is not to bash the social workers, the system as it is, because it's a very difficult job. I know because I was one.
Mm-hmm.
But, I was also 23 when I had that job.
Yeah.
So your social worker might be a 23-year-old kid that
has no idea what they're doing.
No idea what they're doing. Has had training, sure, but not really any real life experience.
Mm-hmm.
And just needed a job fresh from college. And again, I'm not bashing the individual social worker. I don't know who it was that did the house study, but the quality of that may not sound as good or may not be as good as it sounds on paper.
Well, yeah, that does appear to be the case here. Let me tell you about where Jocelyn, Stephen, and their children were living. Stephen and Jocelyn are reportedly environmentalists who wanted to live a sustainable, off-the-grid lifestyle.
That explains the last name that they gave to their kids.
Yeah. So they built a cabin on about 10 acres of land in Casiuna, New York. This cabin was about 900 square feet with 1 bedroom and no bathrooms. It did not have running water or electricity.
Okay.
They did, however, have a generator that they would sometimes run. And when it was cold, the entire family, which again was 5 children and 2 adults, all slept in the same room in order to conserve heat.
I'm wondering how much of that came out in the house study, or did that information come out after?
I mean, if you visit the house, you can tell it's a 900 square foot cabin with no electricity or running water or bathrooms.
Right, but I'm wondering whether they had the generator running when the home visit took place and said something like, oh, well, we just keep the generator running, and that's...
But there's no bathroom!
Hey, look, I don't know what the legal requirements are in New York as far as, like...
I would think a bathroom would be one.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, so that's wild to me that they were able to adopt in the first place.
Right.
Jaliek came to live with the Kerr McDonald family right before his 7th birthday. For several years, he was on medication and received counseling. Despite the struggles in his life, his grandmother, Barbara Reilly, says that Jaliek was a sweet boy who was always positive and had a great outlook on life. He loved coming over to her house and playing on the computer or with tarot cards. He called this Granny Camp.
Nice.
He was also a voracious reader who would read several books every week. He also played guitar and dreamt of being a rock star. While his home life was unconventional, to put it nicely, Barbara said that by that point, Jaliek had been in so many different homes that he could basically adapt to anything. He just wanted to belong. He just wanted someplace stable and permanent. Unfortunately, his adoption into this family wasn't the happy ending that everyone would want for him. We already talked about Jaliek's reactive attachment disorder and the issues it caused. Well, it turns out Stephen Kerr had anger issues of his own, and the combination of the two was not good. Barbara recounted a story on the show Never Seen Again, in which Jaliek was tapping his fingers on the table, and Stephen asked him to stop. Jaliek continued the tapping, and Stephen grabbed the child, dragged him outside, and repeatedly dunked him in a creek.
Jesus Christ.
Jocelyn came out, and Jaliek said that he was going to tell his counselor about what Stephen had done. Jocelyn asked him not to, and said that Steve would write him an apology letter and do all of Jaliek's chores for a month if he promised not to tell his counselor. Jaliek agreed.
I'm sorry, that is insanely infuriating. And I'm trying really hard not to victim blame here, because I'm sure that she was potentially subject to some of his anger as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there might be some abuse issues there.
Yeah, there could be. I honestly don't know.
I mean, that sounds like a victim of domestic abuse. That's pretty standard of like, making excuses for the behavior and for the anger, and don't let this get out. Mm-hmm. That's pretty standard for a victim of domestic abuse.
In another incident that occurred in the summer of 2007, Barbara said that Stephen was mad at all of the children and that Jaliek got the worst of it. She didn't go into details, but said that Jocelyn made Stephen stay with his parents in nearby Greenwich for 6 weeks and attend anger management classes. By October of that year, it was Jaliek's turn to have an explosive outburst, but this one would change everything in the young boy's life. Prior to moving in with Stephen and Jocelyn, Jaliek had attended public school, but after they took him in, they unenrolled him and had him join the homeschooling group that they sent their other children to. It was in this homeschooling group that Jaliek made a threat of sexual violence toward a small child, as she was 4 from one of the reports that I read. This was, of course, terrifying and completely unacceptable. It also led to a complete downward spiral. After this incident, Jocelyn didn't call a therapist or try to get her son back into counseling. Instead, on October 23, 2007, she called a crisis hotline and told them that Jaliek had become unmanageable and that they wanted to reverse his adoption, sending him back to foster care.
Oh my God. Obviously what he said was completely unacceptable.
Yeah.
But like this poor kid.
I know.
To have to go through this again?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God.
So the person on the other end of the call pointed out that reversing an adoption is, pretty extreme and difficult and might not even be possible. So they suggested that it may be better to put Jaliek into respite care while everyone cooled down. Respite care is a resource for adopted families who have adopted a child with special needs or one who has experienced abuse and neglect. It's basically a short break for caregivers and their families that allows everyone to get some space before coming back together. So Jaliek was sent to the home of Elaine and Tom Persons and spent the next week there. According to Elaine, Jaliek was wonderful while he was in their care, telling the Bennington Banner, quote, "In those 6 days, we came to love that child," end quote. Most news articles say that when Stephen picked Jaliek up on November 1st, he was going to take Jaliek to a different respite care home the next day. However, when she was interviewed on Never Seen Again, Elaine said that Jaliek was supposed to return to their home. In either case, Jaliek and Stephen didn't return to their family home when Steve picked him up. Jocelyn still wasn't ready for Jaliek to be around their other children or to come back into their home. So instead, Stephen took Jaliek to spend the night at his parents' house in Greenwich, New York. Stephen's parents were out of town at the time, so the home was empty. Stephen picked Jaliek up and the pair went to dinner at Red Robin in Latham. They left around 8 and made the 45-ish minute drive to Greenwich. Stephen later told police that he told Jaliek to go to bed around 9 p.m., which is basically right when they got home. And he also said that Jaliek didn't speak to him on the ride back. When Stephen checked in on his son the next morning at around 7, Jaliek appeared to still be asleep. A little while later, he went back into the room and discovered the bedclothes had been arranged on the bed to make it look as though someone was sleeping in there, but the bed was empty. Stephen says he looked around and discovered 2 pieces of paper. One just said Albany, which is the capital of New York and the city where Jaliek's half-brothers live. However, Jaliek had not had any recent contact with them and had actually only met them once during a supervised visit over 2 years prior. The second piece of paper was much more concerning. It was a note written by Jaliek that said, "Dear everybody, I'm sorry for everything. I won't be a bother anymore. Goodbye, Jaliek." Stephen says that he searched for Jaliek around the house and in the neighborhood, and when he couldn't find him, he called police just a few minutes before 9 a.m.
So this was all according to Steve?
Yeah, so it does sound like that people did see them at the Red Robin the night before. So that part is verified.
But nothing else can be verified.
Correct.
I'm sorry, I'm very suspicious of Steve at this point.
Yeah.
Given his history of outbursts and rage, especially towards Jaliek.
Yeah. Police launched a search and were joined by multiple agencies. In the first article written about Jaliek on Monday, November 5th, it states that Cambridge Greenwich Police were joined by New York State Police and the Greenwich Fire Department in ground searches that included the Battenkill River. Police immediately classified Jaliek as a runaway, so an Amber Alert was not issued. And in New York State, as well as many other states, there has to be evidence of an abduction.
Right.
Yeah. But by the time he was interviewed by the Post-Star for that November 5th article, Greenwich Police Chief George Bell was beginning to have his doubts. He told reporter Allison Martin, quote, "It's cold, he's hungry, he doesn't have money, he hasn't surfaced. That bothers me. It's not your average runaway. Right now, it's been too long in my opinion. He's got to come in, he's got to get warm," end quote. By November 5th, news of the missing boy had started spreading around Greenwich, and on that day, more than 75 searchers combed the woods looking for Jaliek, but found no evidence of the missing 12-year-old. Chief Bell told reporters that they had found no evidence that Jaliek had been the victim of a crime, but did say that investigators from the State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation and Washington County Sheriff's Office had joined the inquiry. The State Police Major Crimes Unit had also been called in. Investigators acknowledged that though there was no proof of foul play, they were treating this disappearance as a homicide in order to preserve evidence.
Good.
Yeah.
I was going to ask if they had done any fingerprinting on the note. Had they done any handwriting analysis? I would just be curious to see if Jaliek's fingerprints were on the note.
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't have any specific information about fingerprints, but Elaine Persons, the woman who Jaliek had been staying with the week leading up to this, when the news about this note broke, she said, that's interesting because that's not a note that Jaliek wrote in Greenwich. That is a note that Jaliek wrote at my house as an apology note to the homeschooling group. Stephen and Jocelyn had asked him to write an apology note. And according to Elaine, he wrote that note at her house.
Okay. Suspicion all over Steve now.
Yeah. While the searches went on, Stephen Kerr appealed to his son saying, quote, "We'd love for you to come home and try to figure this out. We really love you, Jaliek, and just want to know where you are and that you are safe," end quote. As the searches continued, multiple sightings of Jaliek were reported, but none were substantiated. The fact that Jaliek was still gone and the searchers hadn't turned up anything made investigators gravitate more and more toward foul play. So where was the first place that they looked? Obviously, it's going to be his adopted parents, Steve and Jocelyn. Police asked both of them to take polygraphs, and they both agreed. In fact, Jocelyn said that they volunteered to take them in order to rule themselves out so police could focus elsewhere. They also went out with other family members to hand out missing persons flyers. Jocelyn told the Post-Star, quote, "We just hope he's safe. We really want him to come home," end quote. And this is all in about the first week of the investigation. Jaliek's parents also told police that Jaliek was both homicidal and suicidal. Divers searched the river near the Route 40 bridge based on their statements that Jaliek had talked about jumping off a bridge. Chief Bell told reporters, quote, "We want to check around every major bridge between Troy and Greenwich," end quote. Searches also took place near the Windy Hills golf course after Jaliek's family said they had spent time there. They also began to comb surveillance videos from local businesses in the hope of catching the boy on one. While they didn't find Jaliek on any of those videos, they did find something interesting.
Steve?
Well, maybe. Surveillance cameras from a bank near Stephen's parents' house caught a van that looked very much like the gold Dodge van that Steve had been driving that night. And, that wouldn't be a red flag. I mean, it's a bank near his parents' house, and he was going to his parents' house. You would expect to see him on the video.
Right.
Except for the fact that it was 12:16 a.m. when the van passed by, hours after Steve and Jaliek were supposed to be home and asleep.
Mm-hmm.
Now, unfortunately, the video wasn't clear enough to get a license plate. So they, to this day, have not been able to confirm that that was, in fact, Steve. He, of course, denies that he was out of the house past, 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock when they got there. Investigators also got a hold of Steve's cell phone records and found another anomaly. He received a call from an acquaintance around 8:15 p.m. shortly after the pair left Red Robin. This person reportedly said that Steve sounded agitated on the phone. Police asked Steve about the call, and he said he received it on his way to his parents' house while he was passing Henry's Garage in Melrose. However, that's not the cell phone tower that the call pinged off of. It pinged off of a tower near South Troy. South Troy is technically between Latham, where the Red Robin was, and their destination in Greenwich, but it would have taken them out of their way. Police asked Steve's permission to search the van, but he declined on the advice of his attorney.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Steve lawyered up within about a week of his son going missing.
Of course, I would never say that you shouldn't lawyer up, because if you are starting to be looked at as a suspect,
you should absolutely have legal representation. Right. Yes.
However, that in particular, my attorney says I should say no to this search of a vehicle. I mean, that is a huge red flag.
Yeah. After Jaliek had been missing for about a week, police began to scale back the ground searches, saying that they would only perform searches in locations that were based on actual leads.
Yeah.
Temperatures had dipped into the 20s, and police believed that unless someone had taken Jaliek in and given him food and shelter, he wouldn't have been able to survive that amount of time outside.
Yeah, were there any clothes missing or anything like that? I don't know whether I don't remember you saying that.
Yeah, because I've seen conflicting reports on that. There have been some reports that said nothing was missing. Some said that, maybe some clothes, he did take some clothes with him, but yeah, that was unclear.
Nothing confirmed.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Though Steve and Jocelyn hadn't been named as persons of interest in their son's disappearance, they did hire an attorney and mostly stopped talking to the press, with a few exceptions. The couple did some television interviews that people thought were bizarre. In fact, 2 weeks after Jaliek went missing, police subpoenaed unedited videos of these interviews. Here's an example of one of them, which aired on Channel 10.
Stephen Kerr and his wife Jocelyn spoke to us from Stephen's parents' home in Greenwich. It's the only place that Jaliek was allowed to stay after his father says his rages became too much for them to handle. He says the night Jaliek went missing, they'd just come back from Albany. Jaliek had been at a respite home, a break from the family after allegedly making a sexual threat to another child. Stephen says on the ride back, he wanted Jaliek to apologize to his family.
So in Easton, I mentioned to him that he was going to have to get together with a group of children who he had seriously damaged his relationship. And then he didn't say another one. When we got here, I asked him to go to bed. I don't even think he said that.
Stephen, the last person to see Jaliek, says he watched a movie and then went to bed. In the morning, he found a goodbye note.
Well, then, oh my God.
Stephen and his wife say suspicion was immediately placed on them.
When Stephen still refused to take the polygraph and refused to confess to something that they were trying to get him to confess to, they were asking him questions which are totally inappropriate.
In addition to refusing the polygraph and to offering up DNA, police point to Stephen's strange behavior, like selling eggs at Jaliek's vigil and also going on and on about Martin Luther King Jr.
I know that you're very passionate about Martin Luther King. No, I'm very passionate about my son.
Stephen has refused a polygraph test and to also offer up his DNA. Jaliek's parents say it's because the police have been accusatory from the start.
They were asking him questions which are totally inappropriate, like, oh, so you watched a porn movie with your son and you had sex with him and then you hit him on the head and dropped him in a ditch. Just tell us where the ditch is.
Police say it is Stephen's own behavior that has led to suspicion. Like during a recent vigil for Jaliek when Stephen sold eggs and spoke more about Martin Luther King Jr. than his son.
I know that you're very passionate about Martin Luther King. No, I'm very passionate about my son. And you know what? If you can't rely on people you call your heroes when the time is tough, who do you rely on? News media? Jerry Springer?
Stephen says he has nothing to do with Jaliek's disappearance and has committed his life to take care of troubled children, just like Jaliek.
So I would like everybody watching to know that my wife and I committed a few children that the rest of you threw away.
There was a lot there.
A lot.
So... Geez, where do we start? Well, it sounded almost like this was rehearsed, at least part of it, because at a certain point he stopped, didn't have the right words, And then his wife, who was sitting next to him, basically, quote, like gave him a line.
Interesting.
Which I heard, and I thought that was weird because it didn't seem as though it was very natural.
Yeah.
So then he flips out.
Gets very angry with the reporter.
For seemingly no reason. I mean, it seemed like a perfectly reasonable question.
Yeah.
It actually wasn't even a question.
It wasn't. She just brought up the fact that he talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and he got real pissed.
Freaked out. Yeah. Then he started spitting off ideologies about, heroes and not trusting the news media who he's giving an interview to. Then we have what his wife said, which was odd. I guess they don't understand how interrogations work and how if you're under suspicion, they're going to be accusatory of you because that's the basis of you being under suspicion, right?
Yeah.
It's like they're going to accuse you of things. They're going to ask you questions like, what did you do with your son?
Mm-hmm.
Where did the porn hitting him on the head and then throwing him in a ditch, where did that come from?
According to Jocelyn, that came from the interrogation. The police have never spoken to that.
Yeah.
So they've never said like, no, we never said that, or yes, we did.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I wouldn't put it past them. Like, I think that sometimes you do see that in interrogations where they'll like come up with a scenario, a wild scenario just to kind of get a reaction.
Yeah, sure. I don't know. Just during the two of them seem very odd.
Yeah.
And then they kept saying throughout the whole thing that they refused a polygraph, but I thought you said that they did take a polygraph.
Yeah, well, that's a good point because initially they did both agree to take polygraphs. Jocelyn did. So Jocelyn did quickly take a polygraph. The results of that have never been released. But while Steve did initially agree, he was questioned at the state police station in Greenwich for several hours in mid-November. He began to take a polygraph, but left in the middle and refused to finish. His attorney, Terrence Kinsland, told his client not to take the polygraph and not to answer any other questions without him present.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't trust polygraphs at all.
Right.
And we've talked about that before. However, agreeing to it and then leaving in the middle of it,
it doesn't look good.
No, and I'm sure given that interview, it was probably in the middle of an outburst of anger.
Yeah.
At the questions that they were asking.
And that's what it sounded like. It sounded like he stormed out of there.
Yeah. I mean, none of this looks good for him.
Yeah. And then, so Steve was complaining about how he was treated by the state police. And the state police are literally like, we took him and got him lunch. Like, we picked up donuts. Like, I don't understand what he's talking about. Like, it was perfectly fine. But he was complaining that he was treated so badly by the state police and said that he welcomed the FBI's involvement. He's like, I don't want to deal with this. Let's bring in the FBI.
Okay.
However, when the FBI asked Steve to take a polygraph, he refused once again. He also declined to fill out a behavioral analysis form about Jaliek. Jocelyn, however, did fill out the form. Searches for Jaliek continued throughout the end of 2007 with no results. But then, in 2008, a new clue emerged. In January, an anonymous letter was sent to the news outlets, including News Channel 13 and the Post-Star. It was postmarked in Westchester County and had no return address. It was typed on a background image that looked like crumpled paper. It said, "Jaliek still alive. Needed a foot soldier for this war on drugs. Picked him up on Route 40, Post 30. He's okay. No fake. He says, ask his mama and papa. Who are the Macaroni family?" And macaroni's misspelled. "My cat named Diamond? Why does Franti yell fire? Don't try to look. We are not there."
What the hell does any of that mean?
No one really knows. Jaliek did have a cat named Diamond who was dead by that point. The line, "Why does Franti yell fire?" could be a reference to the song Yell Fire by Michael Franti and Spearhead. But beyond that, police and really everybody else is baffled.
It was typewritten, huh?
Yeah. Investigators were eventually able to secure a search warrant for the home where Jaliek was last seen, and one of the items seized was a home printer.
Mm-hmm.
The implication, of course, is that someone in Jaliek's family wrote that note in order to throw investigators off and maybe lend more credence to the gang theory that Jaliek's parents had been throwing around.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they had started saying early on that they thought that Jaliek might have run off to join a gang in Albany.
Which is totally out of left field. Like,
yeah.
What are you even talking about?
Nobody had any idea what they were talking about.
What knowledge do they have of any gangs in Albany?
Yeah, and what knowledge would Jaliek have? He was 12.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, it's bullshit. I'm sorry, but it's just complete bullshit.
Yeah, and so Stephen and Jocelyn are white. Jaliek is biracial, and so a lot of people are like, that just sounds kind of racist. Like, you know?
A bit. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, just all of this is outrageous. I mean, again, like, you know, they're off-gridders living in a fucking cabin. So, you know, they don't have any news outlets, right?
I mean, I assume maybe they had like cell phones or whatever, but I don't know. The whole thing's
wild.
And they had like normal jobs. Like, I mean, that's the thing. It's not like they were living in this cabin without running water because they were poor. Like, they had plenty of money and like they were involved in society. I don't know. Like, the whole thing, though, is just very strange. So in February 2008, just a few months after Jaliek went missing, Steve and Jocelyn packed up their remaining children and moved to Vermont. Their New York home remained vacant, but not empty. So remember Jocelyn's mother, Barbara Reilly?
Mm-hmm.
She was the granny camp one. Well, after about the first week or so of the investigation, police weren't the only ones that Jocelyn and Steve refused to talk to. She said in that episode of Never Seen Again that about a week after Jaliek went missing, Jocelyn told her that she didn't want to have any further contact with her and that Barbara was not to have any contact with her children either.
Why?
Well, because Barbara had started to have some suspicions of her own. And beyond that, it seems as though these suspicions started almost immediately. She later told reporters that she was with the family on the first day of the search and noticed several odd behaviors. She said that when a friend spoke to Jocelyn and offered to help search for Jaliek, she just laughed at him. She also said that she saw Stephen roughly rubbing his eyes so that he would look like he had been crying when he spoke to the media.
Mm.
Barbara loved her grandson, and she wanted him found. She decided immediately that the side she was taking in this matter was going to be Jaliek's. And I think it's very telling in this story that after about the first week, the people who were fighting for Jaliek were not his parents. It was Barbara, her husband, Dennis, and Jaliek's former foster parents, the Shones, the Persons, the ones who had him in respite care. Like, they formed their own task force, basically, to find Jaliek. And Stephen Kerr and Jocelyn McDonald were not involved. Barbara's personal investigation took her to the one-room home on Ravens Way in July 2008, 8 months after her grandson was last seen. They had already moved out. The house, was unoccupied, but still owned by them.
Mm-hmm.
When Steve reported Jaliek missing initially, he told police that Jaliek was last seen wearing jeans, tennis shoes, and a yellow fleece pullover. Now, I assume that he would have changed to go to bed, but, the assumption you would make is that the jeans, the pullover, the shoes were missing the next morning. So
yeah,
you've got to assume that's what he had on, right? So when Barbara went to the cabin, she found it mostly empty, other than 4 pieces of furniture that they had left behind. However, I guess there's like an upstairs loft area where Jaliek used to sleep at times. She said, quote, Jaliek's belongings were scattered around the area, and there was a stack of washed, dried, and folded clothing. The yellow fleece was in the stack, end quote. Barbara was actually arrested for breaking and entering after this whole thing.
Jesus.
Yeah. But the charge was eventually downgraded to trespassing. Around this time, Barbara also petitioned the courts for custody of Jaliek. While this may seem like an odd move, considering he was missing, Barbara did it in order to gain access to documents and records that only Jaliek's guardians are permitted to access.
Mm-hmm.
This push came after the state police called Barbara one day asking her for a document. She didn't have the document and noted that Jocelyn and Stephen had refused to assist the investigation by turning records over.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, Barbara lost her case largely because there is no case law to support custody being granted in such a situation. After their move to Vermont, Stephen and Jocelyn stopped speaking publicly about Jaliek or the ongoing searches for him. On the 5-year anniversary, the Intelligencer requested an interview, but it was declined via their new attorney, Jeffrey McMorris. Instead, McMorris gave a statement that said, quote, "They have said from the beginning that they are confident Jaliek is coming home one day. That's what they absolutely believe. And Jaliek wouldn't quite understand what all the fuss is about." End quote.
What?
I have no fucking idea.
That statement makes no fucking sense. That last
part. I've seen that in a couple different times, because over the years, when asked for comments, they've refused, and then the lawyer would speak, and it's always been some variation of this. It's like they think he's coming home, and like he wouldn't understand why there's such a big fuss made over him leaving, like as a 12-year-old. Like what?
Why would you even say that?
I don't know. And this is from a lawyer. Like, you would think he would be smarter than to say something so dumb.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Dennis Smith, Barbara Reilly's husband and Jaliek's grandfather, did speak to reporters and had a very different take on Jaliek's whereabouts, saying, quote, "We miss our grandson and we want to find out the truth about what happened to him. In my mind, there's no doubt he came to harm at the hands of his father. I think we just need some kind of break in the case." End quote.
Yeah, I agree with him 100%. It just seems to me that Stephen and Jocelyn came up with a plan to go get him, take him to Steve's parents' house, which they knew was vacant,
mm-hmm.
and probably murder him. That's my theory.
So you think it was premeditated?
100% on both their parts.
I don't know. So Barbara talked to reporters, and it doesn't really sound like she thinks it was premeditated. She said, quote, "Stephen had come to the end of his rope. He couldn't handle Jaliek." End quote. So like,
yeah, I mean, okay, I get that. He clearly,
yeah,
from that interview, he's got anger issues and he flies off the handle very quickly. My thought process behind the premeditation is the fact that he went to respite care to pick him up, but came up with this story, or the story is that he couldn't go back home or couldn't take Jaliek back home because Jocelyn didn't feel comfortable. So he took him to essentially an abandoned house. I mean, not abandoned, but one that was vacant. But he was supposed to go back to respite care. So why was he picking him up and taking him to his parents' house in the first place?
I don't know. And it makes less sense considering that Elaine said that he was supposed to go back to their house.
Right.
It would make more sense if he was going to a different respite home.
Yes.
Because, then,
that would make sense for him to be there. But why was he there in the first place if he was going back to Elaine's house?
Right. The only thing I can think of is if there was some sort of requirement that, like, you could only spend X number of days at a time.
Maybe.
Yeah. And so there had to be, like, a 1-day break in order to take him back to the same home.
Sure. Yeah.
That's the only like legitimate reason I can think of.
Yeah, otherwise it doesn't make any sense for him to come and pick him up.
No, and that's always confused me.
Like if that's not a requirement.
Yeah.
And he was going to go back and like he was supposed to stay at Elaine's anyway.
Yeah.
And Jocelyn's not comfortable with him being at the home. Why would Stephen go pick him up and take him to an empty house to hang out with him?
Yeah.
Yeah, allegedly hang out with him, and then
I don't know.
Like it just doesn't make any sense.
Like, because before I started researching this case, like I knew about it, but yeah, and I had always just been under the impression, because a lot of the news articles said that he was at the person's home And Steve picked him up and he was supposed to go to a different respite home. And so that did make sense why Steve would pick him up.
Yeah.
But Elaine herself said
he was
on
supposed
that
to come
show,
back.
he was coming back to her house. And I would tend to believe her over just what was in a news article, right? Because when you're covering a story, like sometimes little details get mixed up like that.
Right.
But when Elaine says he was coming back to my house, it stops making as much sense unless, like I said, there had to be some legal
requirement to, and maybe that is the case, which would then make more sense of why he was there.
Right.
But if he was just supposed to be staying at Elaine's, then
I don't know.
Why would Stephen be there and take him to an empty house?
Yeah. Oh, and interestingly, I mean, we hear from Barbara and Dennis, all the time, but I have never heard anything from Steve's parents in all this. And it was their house.
Right.
So I don't know.
Was that house searched?
Yeah, the house was searched.
That
was the house that was searched where they took the printer.
Okay.
Because obviously they didn't have a printer at the cabin in the woods,
Yeah, right.
But yeah, they've never come out and spoken about Jaliek or anything.
Mm.
So Barbara, like I said, she believed that Stephen just had come to the end of his rope. And, she also said that while she will always have hope, she does not believe that Jaliek is still alive. Over the years, there have been reported sightings of Jaliek in multiple states. Steve and Jocelyn's attorney said that they work with police every time one of these sightings comes up. However, he then went on to say, quote, "My information on the investigation is from the media. We have never been allowed to participate in the investigation," end quote.
Because your clients are suspects.
And they've refused anything that police have ever asked of them.
Yeah.
Other than Jocelyn initially taking the polygraph and filling out the behavioral form for the FBI. I do want to point out that she did do those things.
Right. But the police don't have to share information with you. They're especially not going to share information with you if you and your clients are refusing to help them in the investigation.
Right. And if, you believe Barbara, when Barbara says that they're not even doing simple things like handing over records and documents related to Jaliek.
Yeah. This isn't discovery in a trial. You don't get free access to what's going on in an investigation.
Yeah. So, this whole we haven't been allowed to participate is obviously nonsense. And Chief Bell called it out. He said that he had a suspect, but did not name names.
Steve.
Yeah. He did say, however, that he no longer considered Jaliek to be a runaway. And quote, "After 5 years, we've had zero cooperation from the parents. I think that speaks volumes," end quote. That same year in 2012, police officially changed the status of Jaliek's case from a missing person to a homicide. Jaliek's grandparents, Barbara and Dennis, attended the press conference, but his parents were nowhere to be found. The most heartbreaking part of this press conference was that Chief Bell asked Nick Meck to remove the aged progressed photo of Jaliek from their website, as he didn't believe that Jaliek made it to his 13th birthday. I know this part gets me again, because there's one age progressed photo of Jaliek from, I think, 5 years in. I have to do a lot of editing in this episode. But it's been 17 years and there haven't been any more done. By the 5-year anniversary, Stephen Kerr had also officially been labeled a person of interest, but Jaliek's case seemed no closer to being solved. 2 years later, in 2014, investigators returned to the home on Ravens Way that Jaliek shared with his adopted family. By this point, the home had been sold and the new owners consented to the search, which was mainly focused on the land surrounding the house. Police brought out cadaver dogs, but nothing was found. Jeff McMorris, the attorney, spoke to the Post-Star on behalf of Steve and Jocelyn and said, quote, "Their opinion hasn't changed. He's going to show up someday," end quote. Along with the multiple sightings over the years, anytime bones or a skeleton were found in the area, Chief Bell's phone rang. One promising discovery came in February 2016, and it's hard to call it a promising discovery, right?
Yeah.
But the people who love Jaliek are just looking for closure and evidence. And that's going to come in the form of remains, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So in February 2016, a hiker discovered a skull near the Hudson River in South Troy. However, forensic testing showed that the skull did not belong to Jaliek. The 10-year anniversary came and went in 2017 with no real movement on the case. Instead, officials said they were hesitant to make an arrest because they haven't found the body. So the search continued. Years went on, and Jaliek's case went cold in that, there wasn't new evidence. But unlike some other cases we've covered on this podcast, the investigating agency has remained committed to this case and continues to investigate any tips or leads that come their way. One big one came just a few weeks prior to this episode being aired, and it's what prompted me to finally cover Jaliek's story. On October 20th, 2024, Troy Police Patrol officers responded to a report of bones discovered at Burden Pond. And if you recall, this is one of the first areas that was searched for Jaliek. Officers quickly determined that the remains were human, and news instantly spread that Jaliek could have finally been found. This lead was the most promising one in years, especially because just 2 years earlier, in 2022, police searched near this exact area again based on a tip they had received. Fortunately, part of the remains that were found included a skull, which investigators were able to compare to Jaliek's dental records. Unfortunately, on October 23rd, the Troy Police Department confirmed that the skull did not match the dental records, and the body found was not that of Jaliek Rainwalker. Before the news broke that the remains found were not Jaliek's, Barbara spoke to the press about the discovery. She said, quote, "If it's not Jaliek, I'll go back into the mode of waiting every day to hear, which I've been in for years, and many, many other people who have cared about Jaliek for all this time will probably go back into the same mode," end quote. Unfortunately, that's the mode that Barbara and the rest of the people who loved and have fought for Jaliek find themselves back in. They must be asking themselves if Jaliek is ever going to get justice, or if anyone is ever going to have to answer for this young boy's death. Barbara has said in the past, years ago, that she would rather wait until they have a strong case than end up going in too early and ending up with a hung jury or an acquittal. But at the time that she said this, I don't know if she could have even imagined that 17 years after her grandson disappeared, they would still be basically in the same place. In those 17 years, Stephen and Jocelyn have reportedly stayed married. All of Jaliek's adopted siblings are adults who are now living their own lives. But no one who lived in that house on Ravensway has spoken publicly about their lost family member since 2007, nor had they spoken to Barbara Reilly or Dennis Smith. Jaliek's grandparents remain estranged from the rest of their family, but they continue to fight for Jaliek. A few months before these bones were found, Channel 6 News in Albany spoke to retired state police investigator Tom Aiken. He said that in order for Jaliek's case to move forward without a body, a special prosecutor with experience in trying no-body cases needs to be brought in order to, quote, do it right. But he also said that time is their enemy and that they have nothing to lose by taking a shot at it now. I think this is tough, and there are a lot of misconceptions around no-body cases. Mm-hmm. A lot of people believe that you can't prosecute somebody for murder if there isn't a body, which you absolutely can.
100%.
Interestingly, when a no-body case is taken to trial, the conviction rate is higher than it is in other homicide cases. So the conviction rate of homicide cases nationwide is in the mid-70s. I forget the exact number. It's like 76%. But the conviction rate for no-body homicide cases is in the 80s. And the reason is because typically it's a lot harder to get prosecutors to take these cases to trial.
Yeah.
So when they do, they believe that their evidence is really strong, which naturally will lead to a higher conviction rate. You know, we have had some high-profile no-body cases lately that have led to convictions that we've covered. So Orrin and Orson West, Jacqueline and Trezell West were convicted of their murder, and they have never been found. Same thing with Corey Bigsby, which we've also covered. He was convicted of killing his son, Cody Bigsby, no body has been found. In Corey's case, he had confessed to the murders several different times while in jail.
Right.
But Jacqueline and Trezell had never confessed, still maintained their innocence, but they were still able to get a conviction. The Kristen Smart case, Paul Flores was convicted for her homicide. But in that case, they did have some forensic evidence that showed that a body had been buried in his parents' backyard. So they were able to bring that forensic evidence to court. There was also the evidence of cadaver dogs alerting in his dorm room at Cal Poly. So those were two kind of like solid pieces of evidence that the prosecution was able to bring. This current case that we're covering of Mamta Kafle here, Naresh Bhatt is currently awaiting trial on the charge of concealing a dead body. He has not yet been charged with homicide, but they have not found her. He's still going to trial for concealing a dead body, but prosecution has blood evidence.
Right. Which could lead them to change the charge from concealing a dead body to homicide.
Yes. And they also have him on CCTV dumping various bags in dumpsters in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
On several different occasions. So there's substantial evidence to hold on to. I think that the problem in this case is there doesn't seem to be anything as substantial.
Nothing concrete, at least not that we know of.
No, I mean, the yellow fleece being found is pretty damning.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
could be easily explained by, I guess he was wrong. That's not what he was wearing.
A different yellow fleece. Yeah. I mean, that
whatever.
could easily be taken care of.
You've got the CCTV of the van, but it can't be proven to be him.
Right.
The van, it doesn't sound like was ever searched.
Mm-hmm. It's probably gone at this point.
They did search the home where Jaliek was last seen, allegedly. Didn't find anything there from what it sounds like. So it is hard. And I think that in terms of no body cases, there's a reason why it's been 17 years and they haven't brought this one to trial.
Yeah.
Because it is more difficult to try a case like this, and you really just need something substantial to hang your hat on. And it just doesn't appear as though they have that in this case.
Yeah. I mean, I think at this point, the only hope that, short of finding remains, I think there's potential if their adult children came forward with information.
Right.
And they may not have it. I don't
know anything.
You're
yeah.
right.
I think there's a really good chance that they don't actually know anything.
Probably. But if they do,
yeah,
and they came forward, that would be a break in the case.
Yeah. Whether prosecutors will or will not bring this to trial remains to be seen. After this latest disappointment just a week ago, they may decide that it is time to take a shot instead of just letting Jaliek's case wither away with no chance for justice. What they do remains to be seen, but we'll be keeping an eye on this in hopes that we continue to see movement on Jaliek's case and eventually justice. Jaliek Rainwalker has been missing from Greenwich, New York since November 1st, 2007. He is a biracial male with brown hair and blonde highlights and green eyes. At the time of his disappearance, he was approximately 5'6" and 105 pounds. Jaliek was 12 years old when he went missing. He would be 29 today. Anyone with information regarding Jaliek Rainwalker's disappearance is urged to call the Greenwich Village Police Department at 518-692-9332. You can see all the sources for this episode along with photos and videos at our website, andthentheywere.gone.com.
And be sure to follow us on social, and Then They Were Gone Pod on Facebook and at ATTWG Pod on Instagram and TikTok. If you like what we're doing, please subscribe and consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It will help new listeners find us. And the more people that listen, the more chances we have of bringing someone home.
And we'll see you here next week for a brand new episode.
See you next week.
And Then They Were Gone is hosted by Kona Gallagher and Ethan Flick. All research, writing, and editing is done by me, Kona Gallagher. Theme music is The Stork by Ketsa. Additional music is provided by Kai Engel. And Then They Were Gone is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you get to